Kerr's alleged slur against a police officer, stupid white bastard, why it doesn't quite fit with her so-called anti-racism stance, why a Palestinian group glorifying terrorism is being allowed to host an event in the heart of Melbourne's CBD, and a Trump-Biden rematch looms as Nikki Haley bows out of the presidential race. But first, the ghosts of the Rudd-Gillard years are circling this government again. We saw it with the boat arrivals last month. Now MPs are openly backgrounding against Albo, just like Rudd did against Gillard in 2013. And remember how that turned out. It's the Labor curse. Well, a rift has emerged within the party as it prepares to hand down its budget. Nine newspapers is today reporting federal ministers are frustrated that key spending proposals are being rejected by Anthony Albanese's powerful inner circle, with Penny Wong and Katie Gallagher dubbed co-deputy prime ministers, in a sign of tension within the upper echelons of the government as it prepares the upcoming budget. In fact, several ministers have spoken anonymously to the paper. One said Minister Ed Husic has complained directly to Albanese that the Cabinet's powerful Expenditure Review Committee was shutting out ministers from decision-making. These leaks reveal Albo has a big problem. If you have several ministers backgrounding against you, you know you're in trouble. And the question needs to be asked, who is running the Labor Party right now? Because it seems as though it's either Wong or Gallagher. It's certainly not the Prime Minister, and his party is imploding. Labor insider Cameron Milner has told me Albanista loyalty and deep paranoia that Albo is increasingly vulnerable is driving the drawing up off the drawbridge. Using Gallagher and Wong as deputies in all but name shows how even compliant Richard Marles isn't in the inner circle either. It's notable that Wong and Gallagher are part of a regular dinner club with the PM, but Chalmers needed a special invitation to attend. Well, it's interesting Jim Chalmers has been named by the paper today as being part of a gang of four, comprising of him, Albo, Wong and Gallagher. That's despite lingering tensions between the PM and his treasurer. And what's that old saying? Keep your friends close and your enemies closer. The last time there was a so-called gang of four was under the first Rudd government, comprising of himself, Julia Gillard, Wayne Swan and Lindsay Tanner. Fast forward more than 15 years, Labor is back to its old schoolyard click tricks. Now, Labor MPs were desperately trying to deny the claims today.
Well, I think I've seen the reports, and I don't think it's any surprise that we have people who would like to do more and a budget that can't do everything.
Are there ministers being shut out of decision-making?
No, I don't believe so. You know, the process that we run to put our budgets together isn't new. It isn't unusual.
Ed Husic named as one. Are you another?
The Albanese government is running a cabinet-style government. We are a long way from where our Prime Minister is appointing himself to 5 or 6 portfolios secretly.
Now, Labor ministers might be playing coy here, but one can't help but feel a sense of deja vu. There have been so many parallels to the Rudd-Gillard years under Albo. Remember this, Furphy?
There will be no carbon tax under the government I lead.
And Albo's own carbon tax moment came in the form of stage 3 tax cuts.
My word is my bond.
Well, as we know, clearly his word is not his bond. Where is the $275?
$275. $275. $275. $275. $275. $275. $275. $275.
And where is the promise that the cost of living crisis would change under his helm? The backflips, combined with backroom manoeuvring and leaking, was what ultimately brought down Julia Gillard. Rudd and his supporters in the party made the most of a struggling Gillard in the polls and were backgrounding journalists. So while Albo has been busy in his new role as chief socialite of Sydney, There is clearly internal mutiny within the party, and Wong and Gallagher are calling the shots. Labor MPs are on the attack, and it's put the PM at odds with his cabinet colleagues. Is he becoming what he fears the most, a one-term PM? Now, I want to talk about double standards when it comes to racism. For days, we've been hearing about Sam Kerr being charged over an alleged racist incident towards a police officer in the UK. There have been multiple calls for her to step down as Matilda's captain, but now, as we know, Sam Kerr allegedly called a police officer a stupid white bastard. According to The Sun in the UK, Australia women's captain and Chelsea striker Kerr is said to have been sick in the cab after a night out. Kerr is then alleged to have unleashed a racist verbal volley when cops arrived to deal with the dispute in Twickenham, southwest London, on January 30 last year. Now, of course, we will let the courts decide what has occurred here. Was it rude? Yes. Was it racist? Potentially. I'll let you decide. And there was mixed reaction today too.
It's racist. It was an emotional reaction to a situation, and we're not there. We weren't there when it happened. We don't know what the police did to her. We've got no idea really what they did. So we are judging something from a story in a paper, and sometimes, I'm sorry to say, Laura, sometimes newspapers, especially in the UK, they do kind of embellish things.
I wouldn't be offended. Everybody's got to take responsibility for what they say and do.
If someone called you a stupid white bastard, would you think that was racist?
No. I've been called a lot worse, so no.
But imagine had an Aussie captain said this to a black person. It would be game over. Now, everyone would agree racism is not tolerated, yet we live in a world where only some races seem to be protected. So will the same standards apply in this case? It's over to you, Football Australia. But here is the issue I have with Sam Kerr. She can't have it both ways. She often speaks about her Indian heritage and what it's like to be discriminated against for her race and sexual orientation. Kerr has even taken part in anti-racism stands during the Black Lives Matter protests. In 2021, the Matildas, led by Kerr, kicked off their Tokyo Olympics campaign by making a bold statement on the world stage. The team linked arms as New Zealand's players took a knee against racism. Then she and the team posed with the Aboriginal flag and told media, "We felt that we didn't want to just do something that goes along with the grain. We wanted to do something that was relevant to our country and show unity within our group and let everyone feel that they're represented." Now, Kerr is a strong advocate against racism, yet allegedly calls a police officer a stupid white bastard. How could she allegedly even utter those words when she is so staunchly against racism? Well, if you are going to play the identity politics game, then you've got to practice what you preach. You've got to play by those rules, or you end up with egg on your face. Joining me now is commentator Jason Morrison and National Senator Matt Canavan. Hello to you both.
G'day.
Thank you so much for joining me on the show this evening. Look, I want to start with the reports about the Prime Minister's inner sanctum, which, as I mentioned, includes Penny Wong and Katie Gallagher. They're reportedly shutting out other ministers. Jason, the question needs to be asked. Who's running Labor right now? Is it Penny Wong? Is it Katie Gallagher? Or is it actually the Prime Minister of Australia?
I think Penny Wong's been in command for a long time.
Clearly.
But look, they're doing everything Australians don't like, and that is seeing politicians talking about themselves. Mm-hmm. And I don't think this mob get the message. You spent a lot of last year talking about a vote on something which Australians didn't want to have and ended up showing you they didn't want to have. And now we're talking about the problems within. It's obviously real because there are enough people, and I looked at who's written it, and I know both the reporters, they're not makeup artists, no. There's something there, and I think you'll find that this is the warning shot. This is the shape up or get ready for the cages to be rattled, and that cannot be too far away. No, well, you think it wouldn't be too far away. Matt, I mean, we've got several ministers now backgrounding against the Prime Minister, and we've seen this all before, back in the Rudd-Gillard years. It's like deja vu all over again.
Well, you're right, Danica. It's not so much the details of these reports. I mean, there's always tensions among cabinets and ministers about decisions and how they're made the revealing fact here is the leaking of it, the backgrounding of it, as you say. And there's obviously people very upset to do that. And I think they're under pressure. I think this government's under pressure because their voters are under pressure. And this is just a symptom of the fact that under this government, real wages have gone back to 2011 levels. People have gone back in their standard of living for 10 years, that their promises about energy prices have not come true, and that they've completely mismanaged our borders, and we've ended up with a lack of housing for Australians, and those who are renting can't not even be able to afford it. So that's the problem, and because that pressure is now on the government, they're starting to crack. And I think Australians are waking up to a government that doesn't have the solutions for the problems we face right now.
Well, you're right. The cracks are certainly there, that's for sure. Now, we heard today that parents will receive superannuation on top of their publicly funded paid parental leave from July next year in a major pre-budget spending commitment by the government. Jason, it's designed to win over female voters. Do you think it'll work?
I think, weirdly, I think it's an important thing, this. I guess, I speak from some personal experience. My wife chose to be out of the workforce for 6 years to bring up our kids when they were little. And we now notice the enormous impact on her superannuation. I mean, the reality of our situation is we've got to stay married. That's the reality of it. But the funny thing about this is I look at it and I think you're going to sort of say, well, this is a good thing, and there probably will be some women who will think it's fantastic and whatever else. The super funds have to do their bit. They actually have to commit to not eat away the funds. And, these are union super funds in many times. They've got to learn to stop eating the funds like it's going out of style. Yeah. That'd actually be a far better thing, because what I noticed is that when the money going in stops, the funds coming out don't. Yeah. And that's got to be the problem. But I look at this $200 million. All right, what are you going to cut? Because last time I looked, Australia ain't in a good way financially right now. And what are you going to cut to be able to afford this? Yeah. Because we can't just keep pulling it out of the drawer and throwing it on the table, which seems to be the approach of government and has been for the best part of the last decade, unfortunately.
Yeah, you think it's going to make quite a dent in the budget, that's for sure.
Well, $200 million, I mean, it is a lot of money. I mean, it's a big lot of money.
Yeah, no, it certainly is. All right, well, let's move on, because Tony Burke, or as I like to call him, Travel on Your Purse Tony, is being lashed for his $57,000 4-day US trip, and rightly so. Now, this latest criticism from former Speaker of the House, Bronwyn Bishop, who says Burke led calls for her to resign in 2015 after she spent $5,200 in taxpayer funds on a helicopter trip. Matt, not only did Bronwyn repay that money, but she didn't spend $57,000 of taxpayers' money.
Yeah, I reckon it probably would have been cheaper for Tony to take the chopper over to the US. That might have saved some money. I don't get how. It just doesn't add up to me. I think an explanation is deserved about, apparently, from what I read, only 2 flights were associated with this trip, and obviously business class, but that just doesn't add up. And so what happened here? Were they booked at the last minute? Did they not check different prices? I mean, the taxpayers deserve to have value for money. I don't begrudge ministers travelling overseas. I support it. We've got to make sure that we sell and market our country on the world stage, but they still have to spend your money responsibly, and that clearly doesn't seem to have been happened here. And just like Bronwyn had to, I think Tony should make a full explanation to the Parliament.
Oh, totally. Do you think that pay from your purse, Tony needs to pay it back?
Well, I look at relativity here, right? We've had 3 days of Peter Dutton spent his own money to fly to Gina Rinehart's party and fly back. He spent his own money. We've got 3 days of media coverage out of it. This deserves more than 3 days. Will it get it? And this is the Canberra Press Gallery test. If you thought that was a big story, this is a huge story. And I'll be interested to see if it survives the 3-day test.
Some didn't even touch it. Some media didn't even touch the story. Well, what does that tell you?
Well, it tells you that probably a lot from the government-funded media agency. They kind of think that the public should pay for everything anyway.
Yeah, so, well, that's an absolute fair point. All right, well, let's move on, because former Victorian MP Adam Somyurek has used parliamentary privilege to accuse ex-Federal Labor MP and his old best friend Anthony Byrne of being the traitor politician that ASIO exposed. Take a look at what he has said.
President, we are also told by Mr Burgess that MP in question was close to a former Prime Minister and tried to compromise the former PM's family. Our next task is to investigate characteristics such as history of disloyalty, character, financial and psychological situation. Acting President Anthony Byrne certainly ticks all the right boxes here.
But, and this is a big but, Somyurek actually admitted during this speech in Parliament that he has an axe to grind with his former mate Byrne. Australia's intelligence agencies have denied Mr Byrne is the traitor, and Mr Byrne told us he won't be commenting on the matter. Matt, so much for water under the bridge here.
Well, look, obviously, yeah, I was going to say Adam had an axe to grind. He's admitted to it himself. But look, I'm not going to jump on the hysteria bandwagon here. I think this whole saga over the past couple of weeks has been incredibly unedifying. I think it reflects poorly on ASIO to make these types of allegations without providing the details. I mean, this person, whoever they are, might be completely innocent. And we used to have a judicial system where you were innocent before proven guilty, but everyone's reporting this as if this person is a traitor. We don't even know who it is or any of the real details. And I think it's highly responsible for effectively a law enforcement agency and intelligence services to be out there airing things like a tabloid newspaper. They also have an axe to grind. Of course, these intelligence agencies want to drum up hysteria about these things because they want extra powers and extra money, and I just think that's not very responsible. I think they've acted it highly responsibly, and if they were going to go public with this sort of information, they had to, in my view, release the details and stand behind their claims.
Well, this is the problem now because we've got names being thrown up left, right and centre. ASIO has said we're not going to publicly release it. But then this is when the rumour mill begins. Jason.
Oh, yeah. Look, most Aussies are pretty suspicious anyway of the political class. Yep. And I reckon most Aussies could probably find you 5 names of people they reckon from both sides of politics have sold Australia out. And it's been talked about in pubs, clubs, everywhere. So that it got mentioned in the Victorian Parliament under privilege was just a step that's inevitably going to happen all over the country because there are people's names being put forward. And, you know, Matt, I'm sure you've heard it many times too, speculated upon who it could be, and they're not all on the other side.
Yeah. Well, that's it. I mean, this is a problem, right? Look, let's move on now because we're running out of time. But Meta is staring down the barrel of a possible $1.5 billion fine if it's found to have breached the news media bargaining code. It comes after the parent company of Facebook declared it would not renew payment for content deals with Australian media, like Sky News, to display their news. Matt, the thing here is it could actually cost Meta more in fines now than the money that it actually pays in payment deals to Aussie media. It doesn't make sense.
Yeah, well, obviously this company's acting like a cowboy in this country, and they're doing so because they don't want the same system that Australia's got to go and roll out over the world. We were the first in the world to establish this system, and under the former coalition government, and Canada has tried to follow suit, and I believe Meta haven't played ball over there, so now they're trying to withdraw their support for the system here. Look, I think we've got to have a system in place where people's property rights can't be stolen, and the news is created by our media, by our local media deserves to be rewarded and not just stolen from others. I also want to make sure, though, we don't end up with a situation where all of our media is reliant on laws passed through our Canberra Parliament or decisions by our government. They need to be free and independent. So we've got to strike the right balance here, and there's a problem that needs to be fixed.
Absolutely spot on. Jason, how do you see this playing out now?
It's all in Meta's camp, really. But I'll tell you something the Australian government could do that could really send a message, and that is stop supporting Facebook. The Australian government, New South Wales, Victoria and Queensland governments all spend a bucket load of money advertising on Facebook. I'm amazed how often I see sponsored posts from government agencies in my so-called Facebook feed. They shouldn't be doing it. I mean, if they want to support the Australian media and rural newspapers, which is, I mean, that is the greatest crime. Rural newspapers, television and radio just about doesn't exist in Australia now. And that money is going on Facebook. The Australian government should be supporting that corner of the business to keep it alive, because I think it's appalling that in country towns and really important ones, they haven't got newspapers. The local radio station's piped in from Pyrmont or something. Yeah. It's just wrong.
It's sad.
And you know, the Australian government can mouth on as much as it like about policies and taking on the big international giant. It can actually stop spending with them.
Yes.
I have a little business. I advertise on Facebook at times, so I'm a hypocrite on this front. However, I don't have the money they do to be able to buy into the big media. No. It's an effective way of advertising for sure, but at the same time, if you want to be principled about it, and they're trying to be principled about this, don't support them.
No, fair enough. Time to make a stand.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Now, I want to end on some really sad news, some tragic news. The son of ex-MP Joel Fitzgibbon has died in an ADF parachute exercise gone horribly wrong. Lance Corporal Jack Fitzgibbon was conducting a routine training drill when his parachute failed to open last night. Matt, this is just awful, awful news.
It's heartbreaking, extremely heartbreaking. It's hard to know what to say to Joel and his family, but there's a lot of people in the broader parliamentary environment thinking of him. The messages are flowing thick and fast among people just shocked at this news. But Joel is a patriot, a great Australian, and he's released a lovely statement in the circumstances about the sacrifice that his son's made serving our nation. And now all of our prayers and thoughts are with him and his family, and hope they get through these very difficult times.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just such a sad story. Matt and Jason, thank you so much for joining us on the panel this evening. Well, do stay with us. Coming up after the break, Trump-Biden rematch looms as Nikki Haley bows out of the presidential race. We'll unpack what it all means next, plus calls to cancel a Palestinian censorship-free event after concerns the group may be glorifying terrorism. That's next. Welcome back. Well, it's game on. America is set for a Trump-Biden rematch this coming November. Donald Trump is now officially running unopposed to become the Republican presidential nominee after rival Nikki Haley dropped out of the race following an underwhelming turnout on Super Tuesday. The former South Carolina governor has one last card to play after refusing to endorse Trump, instead challenging the former president to earn the support of those who backed her.
In all likelihood, Donald Trump will be the Republican nominee when our party convention meets in July. I congratulate him and wish him well. It is now up to Donald Trump to earn the votes of those in our party and beyond it who did not support him. And I hope he does that. At its best, politics is about bringing people into your cause, not turning them away. And our conservative cause badly needs more people.
Joining me now live is Sky News contributor Kosha Garda. Kosha, great to see you as always. Thanks for joining us. Is it fair to say everyone saw this coming? Donald Trump was always going to run unopposed, and let's be honest, Nikki Haley eventually was always going to drop out of the race.
I think in the past several weeks to months even for sure, that Trump has been so ascendant, the momentum was clear and everybody saw it coming as all the other candidates dropped out one by one, and people were kind of scratching their heads as to why Nikki Haley stayed in as long as she did. But it is worth noting how I think in 2021, right after Trump stepped down after his first term and January 6th and all of that, nobody actually was sure what was going to happen, and people didn't know he was really in a deficit. People didn't know how he was going to fare, and it's actually shaping up to be one of the biggest political comebacks, I think, in U.S. history.
Well, it's going to be an incredible race to watch. Would you say that the Democrats would have known that this was coming all along? I mean, Trump really now has the energy to run rings around Joe Biden, and the Democrats are stuck with Biden, essentially. Have they made a mistake keeping him in there?
You know, I think this is probably the central question in political circles right now in the U.S., where everybody's wondering, is he in or is he not? And there's a growing, I wouldn't say consensus, but there's certainly camps of people who think that they're brewing towards some kind of switcheroo, either in the summertime or in August, which is when the Democrat convention takes place in Chicago. And all sorts of names have been floating around, from Michelle Obama to Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, and others. We don't know. But I also think at the same time, the faction of people who are supporting Biden and want to continue what happened in the last 4 years is also strong. And I think there might be some infighting or interesting politicking that we might see, because I'm not sure how that story is going to unfold.
No, that's a really good point. It's interesting, of course, Michelle Obama, we know her office yesterday said that she won't run. I just want to ask you, though, in terms of Donald Trump, do you think that his court cases are going to stop him between now and November? How do you see that playing out? You know, that's had a few interesting twists and turns in the last couple of weeks, where there are
4 major criminal cases against him, the 2 by Jack Smith, the federal special prosecutor, and then the Georgia case and the New York case. And all 4 of them have hit different stumbling blocks where it looks increasingly likely that none of them are going to go to trial before November. Anything could change, we don't know, but there's different things that have happened that have led to all of them going that way, from the Supreme Court deciding to hear his immunity case, which is going to delay that one, to the Georgia one is turning into a soap opera fiasco for those that are following it, with the prosecutor running into problems of her own and maybe dismissed from it, and they'd have to refile, and that won't happen before the election either. So it's really interesting that in a way, in poker parlance, people are calling it that he's pulling an inside straight. It was really, really difficult to have all 4 of these delayed and therefore not having some sort of conviction or something before the election, and it looks like he's actually doing it.
Wow, how fascinating. One to watch, that's for sure, but certainly it's all but confirmed Trump v Biden. Now, speaking of, former rival of Trump, Hillary Clinton, has shrugged off concerns for Joe Biden's mental capacity, instead urging voters to re-elect him anyway. This is what she said.
Americans are kind of skittish about age. You know, we really are a culture that worships young people, youth, and all of the artifacts of being young. And there's nothing wrong with that. But I would put Joe Biden's record up against anybody's. So if you're worried about a person not necessarily knowing what's going on, I'd worry a lot more about Donald Trump.
I mean, what a ridiculous comment, Kosha. How deluded is Clinton?
You know, we like to dissect everything because we love our politics back home and, you know, with all these players. I could argue it any which way. It could be that she's supporting him and it's an act of support. It could be, picking up on what we just talked about are they going to pull a switcheroo, that she's sort of signaling that, hey, you know, old people aren't so bad because she's also old, and maybe she's looking at coming back into the mix if they decide to just move Biden out of the way. Who knows what she's saying in that, but I think it's not going to make any difference, I think, with all due respect to the former First Lady.
Do you think she would ever throw her hat back in the ring again, do you think?
You know, that's another name that has been floating around. It's hard to see, but like people say, do not ever count Hillary Clinton out. She's a very ambitious person. She's come very close to it, you know, more than once, and you never know. Buckle up.
Well, you never know. It's US politics. Anything could happen. Kosha Garda, great to speak with you. Thanks so much for joining us this evening. Well, to Melbourne now, where the state's track record for keeping the Jewish community safe isn't looking too good. In recent weeks, we've seen anti-Semitic protests outside Melbourne City Hall, where Jews were violently pushed to the ground by pro-Palestinian activists. Now we learn of a not-for-profit Palestinian organisation using terrorist propaganda to promote a censorship-free art event in Melbourne's CBD tomorrow. Sky News reporter Caroline Marcus reports they posted this image of 2 hijab-wearing women holding up rifles against a backdrop of the map of Israel. The post reads, "If you're looking for a censorship-free space to install, display, demonstrate, or perform your art, please reach out." And joining me now live to discuss this is the chairman of the civil rights organisation Anti-Defamation Commission, Divya Abramovich. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Look, take us through it, because they've been given permission by the City of Melbourne to host this event in the centre of the city during International Women's Day tomorrow, all while using this propaganda, as we've just shown, to promote it.
Good evening, good to be with you. Look, before I address this question, I just want to tell something to your viewers and to anyone out there who still doesn't get it. The situation for the Jewish community here is very bad. We're not okay, it's terrible. We find ourselves in a terrifying world of hatred where the harassment of Jews, targeting, doxing, and singling out of anybody who supports Israel is going through the roof. We have never seen anything like this kind of horror show in our history, and people are frightened. And I've spoken to Holocaust survivors who have gone through the evil of Hitler and the extermination camps, and they have said to me that the level of hostility and aggression against the Jewish community frightens them, and it's something that they've never seen. And as somebody who fights anti-Semitism 24/7, I have to tell you that I've never been more fearful than I am now about what the future holds. This is not normal. And this craziness has to stop. Now, with regards to this event, look, it's just another example of the violent and dangerous rhetoric of the anti-Israel movement, which is becoming much more radical and is turning our streets into battlefields. And these are people who glorify the October 7th massacre of Hamas, the largest mass murder of Jews since the Holocaust. And they're doing it openly. They are celebrating the rape and the murder and the torture of women, the beheading of babies, the extermination of more than 400 innocent Israelis. And yet we have the Melbourne City Council allowing this outrage to happen.
Well, this is what I just don't understand. I mean, you've just described just how awful it is right now in Melbourne as a Jewish person to hear what you're living through in the year 2024. And yet the City of Melbourne says that they're going to closely monitor that art and remove anything that incites hatred. But yet they haven't come out and condemned this group. Are they turning a blind eye to it?
Well, since October 7th, one of the things that I think has hit hardest the Jewish community is the fact that people that we thought were our neighbors, friends, advocates and champions have completely abandoned us. This moral blindness, this walking away instead of locking arms and protecting the Jewish community is a stain that will never be removed and will never be forgotten. And I call on the City of Melbourne to show some moral backbone, to say to the Jewish community, you do count, we do care, and we are going to fight. Look, this particular flyer is a call for arms. It's a call for the destruction of the State of Israel, for the killing of every man, woman, and child. And this cannot stand. This insanity has to stop. This is not the Melbourne that I know and love. And I speak to Jewish students on campus, for instance, who have told me, we are afraid to set foot on campus. We do not feel safe. And this is a moral moment in our country where we need our elected representatives, whether it is the Lord Mayor, whether it is the Premier, whether it is the Prime Minister, to come out and push back against the evil of anti-Semitism.
Well, I note that you've actually called for the council to revoke permission for this gathering. You've tried to reach out to them. Have they responded at all to any of your concerns here?
We've had no response, and this is par for the course with most of the institutions that we've approached. There seems to be a complete lack of concern for the Jewish community, a dismissal. And by the way, this week we commemorated 150 days since the October 7th atrocities. We still have 134 hostages being held by Hamas, and nobody seems to care. Tomorrow we are celebrating International Women's Day. And the message for Jewish women is, you do not matter. We are told that we need to believe women who have been sexually assaulted and raped, unless they are Israeli women. And the fact that we've got these so-called women's organizations and feminist leaders who are supposed to be advocating and are supposed to be standing strong with women, turning a complete blind eye, not caring, not condemning, not issuing any statements about the despicable sexual assaults against Israeli women is something that we will never forget.
It's just so sad. And as I said, we're living in 2024 here. And just on that, as you mentioned, this week marks 150 days since those attacks. You've detailed in our conversation that there's been an explosion in anti-Semitism here in Australia. Why aren't our governments doing more to actually put an end to this, do you think?
I think we're getting a lot of empty rhetoric. I think we're getting words, but we're not getting action. And it comes back to the old issue of the Jewish community matters. Anti-Semitism, and by the way, anti-Semitism is not just a problem for the Jewish community. This hatred, this radicalism, this violence, it may begin with the Jews, but it won't end with the Jews. This is a whole of society challenge. And we've seen what those anti-Israel extremists have done. They've turned our lives upside down. We don't need to wait for the kind of violence that we saw in Israel to erupt on our streets to take these threats seriously. And as I said to you, I have never been more worried about the state of the Jewish community, but also about the level of radicalism that we see spreading like wildfire throughout our nation.
Yeah, it's just absolutely shocking to see. Divya Abramovich, we have to leave it there. Thank you so much for your time this evening. Well, stay with us. Coming up after the break, the Matildas' so-called sweetheart caught in a racism row. And despite the failed voice referendum, an inner city council has voted to establish a similar body anyway. That's next. Let's return to one of our top stories tonight. The Matildas' so-called sweetheart allegedly calling a police officer in the UK a stupid white bastard. Now, of course, we will let the courts decide what has occurred here, but it's hard to avoid the contradictory nature of it all. This is a high-profile athlete who has championed anti-racism causes in the past, citing her Indian heritage and being discriminated against for her race and sexual orientation. Well, if you are going to play the identity politics game, then you've got to practice what you preach. Joining me now to discuss is Sky News host Caleb Bond and Adoni Media's Lisa Goddard. Hello to you both. Thank you so much for joining us on the panel this evening. Caleb, what are your thoughts here? I mean, she's a champion of anti-racism and then she's allegedly made these remarks. Is it hypocritical?
Yeah, look, there is a little stench of hypocrisy here and I suppose to some degree I delight in that. But I also think it is utterly ridiculous that anyone would be charged with such a trivial quote-unquote crime. I mean, for heaven's sake, clearly she was on the sauce, having well, good night, I suppose you might say in some regards. She's had a chunder in the back of a taxi. She's called a copper a stupid white bastard. Now, I mean, you and I receive pretty strange correspondence from time to time, shall we say.
Sure.
And I have received threats before that I have reported to the police, and on a number of occasions I've been told those threats, which are pretty clearly suggesting violence in some way or another, would not meet the standard for any kind of crime. So you've got that on the one hand. Meanwhile, over in the UK, you call someone a stupid white bastard and you've got to go through a 4-day trial.
Yeah.
It's just
and it happened allegedly 12 months ago.
Do they not have real crimes in the UK to be going after? Seriously.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, this is the thing, Lisa. This allegedly occurred 12 months ago. The concern here is that Sam Kerr didn't mention any of this to Football Australia, so that in itself, the optics don't look good. But my point is if she's such a champion of anti-racism, do you think this is hypocritical? Is it double standards?
Well, yeah, you're right. I think it is a double standard, and that's exactly how I was going to describe it. But I think what you'll find now is in pubs and in backyards across Australia, people will be questioning so you can't be a racist against white people. Is that an argument that's now going to be put forward? So Australians don't like it when they think somebody is being given, the benefit of a double standard. So I know she's our golden girl, but I do think it will take some of the gloss off her. And yes, you're right, it has to go through court and through due process, which does seem like a particularly long and strange amount of time for what she's accused of. But yeah, look, at the end of the day, I just don't think it will sit right with most Aussies.
No, and I do have to say, I mean, I wonder, surely there's other big crimes going on in London at the moment, you'd think.
Well, it's not even the worst thing I've been called this week.
Well, that's it. I mean, on the ad break, I called you a couple of names, Caleb, but hopefully you don't report me for that one.
HR.
Now, let's move on because the woke City of Melbourne Council has voted to establish a First Nations Advisory Committee to ensure their voices and aspirations are embedded in the council's core business and decision-making. Caleb, look, 60% of us, as we all know, voted no to the referendum for an Indigenous voice to Parliament, yet we've got one council going on a rogue path and doing it anyway.
Amazing, isn't it? And South Australia is about to have elections for their voice to Parliament down there as well. So the City of Melbourne's not the only mob that hasn't caught on to the national sentiment. You feel day by day that maybe Darren Hinch, who's put his hand up to run for the Lord Mayor of Melbourne, even at the age of 80, could perhaps do a better job than this mob. But I reckon there could be value in this thing. And hear me out, because, of course, what they're saying is we need this thing to advise us on our business and how it relates to Indigenous people. And, of course, we know everything relates to Indigenous people because Indigenous people pay rates, they have their bins emptied, etc. So what we really need is for this mob to go in and say to the City of Melbourne, look, your council exists on stolen land, therefore the council is an illegitimate body and it should be wound up.
What a revelation that would be.
I would be in full support. Anything that might lead to the abolition of a council, I am totally on board with.
I love the sentiment.
Practice what you preach.
Practice what you preach. That's what we've been talking about all night.
The councillor who put up this motion said that they were on unceded land.
Well,
so
this is
just
the thing.
Get rid of the council.
Get rid of the council. I mean, that might solve all the problems, because I've got to say, Lisa, why don't these councils just stick to their day jobs? Whatever happened to roads, rubbish and rates?
Yeah, I'm sure there's plenty of residents in the City of Melbourne who are thinking, I have the odd pothole in my street over here that could do with fixing, as opposed to putting time and money into creating this body that, yes, the majority of Australians said, no, we don't want this. But the problem is, as Caleb said, what we're going to see are all of these councils, which we know overstep the mark. When you talk about gender issues, when you talk about climate change, when you talk about the positions on gas, you name it, the list is as long as it's a laundry list. We're going to see this pop up around the country. And then, of course, you've got what's happening at the state level as well. So we've got a big year here in Queensland. We've got council elections this month. We've got a state election. And, of course, there's the date of when the federal election will be. So it will be very interesting to see how electorates respond when they're starting to see our elected officials focus on these sorts of issues and do exactly the opposite to what the majority of Australians voted for.
Correct. 60% of us said no. Now, former Australia Post head Christine Holgate claims that criticism of high-profile women like former Optus boss Kelly Bayer-Rose-Marin put women off taking on top jobs. Lisa, where do you stand on this? Yeah. Because in the end, if you're a leader, you're going to cop criticism no matter what, because the buck stops with you. How do you agree with these comments? What do you think?
No, look, I was lucky enough to sit through a keynote from Christine Holgate about a year ago, and she very clearly makes the point that there will be criticism along the way, and what both men and women need to be is resilient. And I think that's the message that isn't getting through. We're so fast to sort of put women out there as being the victims or being criticised. You're right. If you're going to put your hand up and be in a senior leadership position in a corporate, or if you're going to put your hand up and be a politician, you are going to cop criticism. There's no way around it, and that's whether it's male or female. So I think it's time to take gender out of this and actually assess people on their ability. It's not a place for quotas. It's not a place for crying, I'm a woman, I'm being picked on. It's what Christina Holgate says, be resilient.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is the thing, Christine Holgate, Caleb was talking about women in these senior positions, but I'd argue that men in high-profile positions have also faced scrutiny. I mean, look at Brad Banducci a couple of weeks ago with Woolworths.
Yeah, indeed. And look, I've got a bit of sympathy for Christine Holgate. I think she was hard done by at Australia Post. But again, that had nothing to do with her being a woman. It was just that the Morrison government thought it could score political points by hanging her out to dry for those Cartier watches that were given as bonuses to staff. They thought, this would be a good cost of living story. I think she was a bit hard done by for that. But to use the example of Kelly Bayer-Rose-Marin, the former boss of Optus, I mean, the way she handled what happened when the Optus network went down and, told people to go on the internet to find out what was going on when they couldn't use the internet because Optus was down, it was just a poorly handled situation. It's got nothing to do with whether you are a man or a woman. Now, sure, we might have had a few examples recently where women have done a bad job of running a company and they've been rightly dragged for it. Sure. It's got nothing to do with what was between their legs. They just did a bad job.
Correct, exactly. And as I said, the buck stops with you. If you're the leader, you're the head of your company, that's just the way that it goes. Now, look, this is an interesting one because Virgin Australia is said to be the first airline in Australia to allow pets to ride inside the cabin on domestic flights starting from next year. The airline is desperately trying to improve its brand image. And what better way to do it than using cute and fluffy animals in its marketing campaigns? Lisa, would you be happy to be sitting next to somebody's pet?
Oh, look, I struggle. I have children. I've travelled with children, young children, but I struggle sometimes, when you're sitting there and you see the baby coming up the aisle and you think, oh, please, not next to me. So I'm not convinced I'd be overly happy if there was a cat or a dog shoved under the seat next to me or behind me. So, no, look, but what I think this is marketing, and you're absolutely right. It's about trying to win over some Australians. And if you ask the people who have had flights cancelled or flights delayed, they would say that our airlines have gone to the dogs a long time ago.
Good one.
It'll be interesting to see how... Yeah, it was the afternoon. It'll be interesting to see how this plays out. But no, look, I don't think I'd be particularly happy with it, to be honest.
I agree with Lisa. I mean, I cringe when you've got a screaming child sitting next to you. What about a barking dog for a few hours?
Well, I think that's kind of the argument in favour of it, isn't it? I mean, you know, if you've already got the screaming child, what's it adding a dog into the mix? Does it really
so you got a child and a dog, and it's just a complete nightmare.
Well, I think I'd be more sympathetic towards the dog than the child, to be perfectly honest. I mean, look, I've got cats, so I don't think I'm going to be taking my cat on. I don't think I'm going to be taking my cat on holiday with me anytime soon. But I feel so sorry for them because I've moved interstate a few times and I had to take a cat interstate, and the poor bugger, he's in the cargo hold in the back of the plane flying from Sydney to Adelaide. You know, it must be a terrifying experience. Just something to make it a little easier.
Well, now you can put him under the seat in front of you.
Exactly, and he knows you're there. What's the big... They've been doing it in the US for years without much complaint. I don't really see the big deal.
No, OK, fair enough. Caleb Bond, Lisa Goddard, great to speak with you both. Thank you so much for joining us this evening, and we'll see you soon as well for the late debate, Caleb. Now, stay with us after the break. Labor's super announcement. Is it just another cost for the government that we all have to pay through taxes? Returning back to Labor's superannuation announcement, the government is preparing to spend big to make sure mums and dads will receive super as well as their parental leave payments. It's expected to cost around $200 million annually, which is definitely going to hurt the budget's bottom line. Joining me now is Judo Bank Chief Economist Advisor Warren Hogan. Warren, good to see you. Thanks for joining us. Is this good economic policy in your view?
Look, it's not bad economic policy, but it is expensive. It's going to cost the taxpayers more, probably $200 to $250 million a year to start, but that will grow a lot. And it's an example of a government that's obviously more than happy to keep spending our money. And of course, that comes in the context of what we now have as one of the biggest government sectors in our economy that we have seen since the 1970s. But in terms of the underlying policy, look, it's all about trying to fill in as many gaps as they can with super, because it's quite clear that most people aren't going to have enough super, and that this is another strategy to try and top as many people's super up as they can.
Yeah, that's very clear, but gee, it's an expensive policy at that. Now, by his own account, Treasurer Jim Chalmers is getting ready to shift gears, signalling that he will eventually need to start dealing with the economy's weak growth figures. Well, you know, that should have been obvious, but this is what he told ABC Radio.
I think inflation is still the main game in our economy, but the balance of risks is shifting. And so will our strategy, not in fundamental ways, but in terms of the difficult balances that we strike between cost of living help and budget repair and investing in growth in the budget. You know, we will maintain a primary focus on inflation, but not a sole focus on inflation. You know, as the risks shift in our economy, the balance shifts in our budget strategy as well, and I think people will see that in May.
Well, that remains to be seen, but Warren, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think the Treasurer is quite clearly paving the way for a bit more spending in this budget. It is obviously a pre-election budget, and the message out of Dunkley is cost of living is everything. And the easy approach to cost of living from the government's point of view is obviously to provide handouts. Now, look, that's all assuming, and I think the undertone of those comments was that the economy is going to continue to be weak, and that inflation is going to continue to fall, and that this spending won't actually put any upward pressure on inflation or interest rates. That's what remains to be seen. We now know that the economy went through a soft landing last year, and we've at least been going for 6 or 9 months.
Yeah.
And it's not at all clear that the economy won't start picking up in this next few months.
No, well, look, it remains to be seen. Warren Hogan, we've got to go. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. And that's all we've got time for today. Stay tuned. Paul Murray is up next.